The Bible is the most printed book in human history, yet much of what's known about how it was written stays inside seminary classrooms. Over the last 2 centuries, scholars combing through ancient manuscripts, archaeology, and the original Hebrew and Greek have uncovered things that surprise almost everyone, including lifelong readers. Who actually wrote these books? When? In what language? And how did 66 separate texts become one volume? None of this is meant to tear anything down. It's simply the history behind the pages. So here are the most fascinating, widely accepted discoveries about the Bible that most people were never taught. Let's begin. Tradition credits Moses with writing the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah. But for over a century, most scholars have doubted that. The text describes Moses' own death and burial, and even calls him the humblest man on earth, an odd thing to write about yourself. The books also blend different names for God, repeat the same stories twice, and use language from much later periods. This led scholars to the documentary hypothesis, the idea that the Torah was woven together from several distinct sources, written by different authors across centuries, then edited into the form we read today. The result is a layered library, not a single memoir. Open Genesis and you'll find not one creation account, but 2, sitting side by side. In the first, spanning chapter 1 into chapter 2, God creates over 6 ordered days, making plants, then animals, then humans, male and female together as the finale. In the second, starting in chapter 2, the order flips. A man is formed first from dust, then plants, then animals, and finally a woman. The 2 accounts use different names for God and a different style entirely. Most scholars read them as 2 originally separate traditions, placed together by later editors who valued both, rather than a single seamless narrative. Once you see the seam, you can't unsee it. The story of a great flood, a righteous man, an ark, and survival was told in the ancient Near East long before the Hebrew Bible. In the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, a man named Utnapishtim is warned of a flood, builds a giant boat, takes animals aboard, and afterward releases birds to find dry land, releasing a dove that returns, then doesn't. The Babylonian tale of Atrahasis tells something similar, and both predate Genesis by centuries. Scholars don't see this as scandal, but as context. The biblical writers drew on a shared regional memory and reshaped it around their own theology. The flood was part of the cultural water everyone swam in. Archaeology tells a quieter origin story than the dramatic conquest in Joshua. The earliest Israelite settlements in the highlands look, in their pottery, architecture, and language, essentially Canaanite. The Israelites appear to have emerged from within Canaanite culture, not as outside invaders who wiped it out. Even the language gives it away. One of the oldest names for God in the Bible is El, which was also the name of the chief god of the Canaanite pantheon. And the name Israel itself contains that very element, meaning something like El rules. The faith that became Israel grew out of and gradually distinguished itself from the world around it. The book of Joshua describes Israel marching around Jericho until its walls collapse, followed by a sweeping conquest of Canaan. But when archaeologists dug at the site, the timing didn't line up. The evidence suggests Jericho was small and largely unwalled or already abandoned during the period the conquest is traditionally dated to. Across the wider region, there's little sign of a sudden, violent takeover of fortified cities. Most scholars now read Joshua less as a war report and more as a theological narrative, written much later to express identity and divine promise. The famous walls make a powerful story, but the ground beneath them tells a more complicated one. Generations grew up picturing Moses parting the Red Sea, walls of water towering on each side. But the Hebrew phrase behind it is Yam Suf, which most literally means Sea of Reeds, not Red Sea. The familiar Red Sea label entered through ancient Greek and Latin translations and stuck in English. A reed sea points to marshy wetlands rather than a deep ocean, which has fueled centuries of debate about what kind of body of water the text imagined. It's a small example of a big truth. A single translation choice, repeated for centuries, can quietly reshape the picture in everyone's mind. The book of Daniel reads like prophecy. It seems to predict the rise of empires, the Persians, the Greeks, and the wars that followed, with startling accuracy. But that precision is the clue. Scholars notice the predictions are detailed and correct right up to the 2nd century BCE, then become vague and inaccurate afterward. The most widely accepted explanation is that much of Daniel was written around that later period, looking back on events as if foretelling them, a common ancient literary technique. So the figure named Daniel is presented as living centuries earlier, while the author wrote from a much later vantage point, encouraging his own generation in their own crisis. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 4 names everyone knows. But the Gospels themselves don't actually name their authors. The texts are written entirely in the third person and never say, "I, the disciple, watched this happen." The familiar titles, according to Matthew and the rest, were added by the early church generations after the books were composed to organize and attribute them. Most scholars hold that the Gospels were written several decades after Jesus' lifetime by educated Greek-speaking authors who were not eyewitnesses, drawing on earlier oral traditions. The name stuck and became tradition, but the books arrived in the world without bylines. It feels natural that Matthew, listed first, was written first. But most scholars conclude the opposite. The Gospel of Mark is the earliest of the 4, written around 40 years after Jesus' death. The evidence is that Matthew and Luke each reproduce large chunks of Mark, often word for word, while adding and polishing his rougher Greek. Mark is shorter, blunter, and lacks a birth story or detailed resurrection appearances. This insight, called Markan priority, reshapes how the Gospels are read. Mark becomes the foundation, and Matthew and Luke become later expansions, each shaping the same core material to speak to a different community. Here's a puzzle. Matthew and Luke share dozens of passages, especially teachings of Jesus, that aren't found in Mark at all. The wording often matches closely, yet the 2 authors clearly didn't copy each other. To explain this, scholars proposed a lost collection of Jesus' sayings that both writers drew from independently. They call it Q, from the German word Quelle, meaning source. No copy of Q has ever been found. It's a reconstruction inferred from the overlaps. Whether it was a single document or a body of oral tradition is debated, but the pattern it explains is one of the cornerstones of modern gospel study. A famous line in Isaiah is quoted as a prophecy, "A virgin shall conceive." But the original Hebrew word is Almah, which simply means a young woman of marriageable age. The specific word for virgin in Hebrew is different, betulah. So how did virgin become the standard reading? When Jewish scholars translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, the Septuagint, they rendered Almah with the Greek parthenos, which more strongly implies virgin. Later New Testament writers quoted that Greek version. It's a striking case of a meaning shifting as a text crossed languages, and it shows how translation, not just the original, shaped what readers came to expect. Several New Testament letters carry the names of Jesus' closest followers, like Peter. But the Gospels describe Peter and others as ordinary Galilean fishermen, and in that time and place, the vast majority of common people couldn't read or write, especially not in polished literary Greek. The letters attributed to Peter are composed in sophisticated Greek that scholars find difficult to square with an unschooled Aramaic-speaking fisherman. Many conclude that some of these works were written by others in the name of a revered figure, a recognized practice in the ancient world. It doesn't erase the text's importance. It just complicates the simple assumption that the named apostle held the pen. Not a single original manuscript of any biblical book survives, not one autograph in the author's own hand. What we have are copies of copies, handwritten by scribes across centuries before printing existed. And those thousands of copies don't perfectly agree. Scholars have cataloged a huge number of differences between manuscripts, most of them tiny, slips of spelling or word order, but some affecting whole verses. The discipline of comparing all these copies to reconstruct the earliest wording is called textual criticism. The takeaway isn't that the text is lost, but that recovering it is detective work, carefully weighing manuscript against manuscript. When the biblical authors wrote, they didn't include chapter or verse numbers. Those were added much, much later as navigation tools. The chapter divisions we use were largely organized in the early 13th century, commonly credited to Stephen Langton. The verse numbers came even later, standardized in printed Bibles in the 16th century by the printer Robert Estinian, also called Stephanus. So the neat reference like John 3:16 is a medieval and Renaissance invention laid over an ancient text. It's enormously useful for finding a passage, but it sometimes chops sentences and thoughts in places the original writers never intended, subtly shaping how the text is read. There was no single moment when a voice declared exactly which books belonged in the Bible. The canon formed gradually over centuries of debate. Many early Christian writings circulated widely. Gospels, letters, and apocalypses, and communities disagreed about which were authoritative. Lists were proposed and refined. Some books now in the Bible, like Revelation and Hebrews, were doubted for a long time, while others that were popular were eventually left out. The familiar 27-book New Testament was first listed in full by Athanasius in 367 and affirmed by church councils in the following decades. The book on the shelf is the product of a long human process of sifting. The Gospel of Mark has one of the most surprising endings in the Bible. In the earliest and most reliable manuscripts, Mark stops abruptly at chapter 16, verse 8. The women discover the empty tomb, are afraid, and tell no one. That's it. No resurrection appearances. The longer ending, familiar to many readers, with later appearances and dramatic signs, is absent from the oldest copies and is written in a noticeably different style. Most scholars conclude it was added by a later hand, perhaps because the original abrupt ending felt unsatisfying. Many modern Bibles now flag those verses with a note, quietly acknowledging the manuscript evidence. It's easy to assume this kind of analysis comes from outsiders trying to undermine religion. The history says otherwise. Modern biblical scholarship was largely founded by devout believers, ministers, priests, and professors at religious colleges who studied the texts closely, precisely because they took them seriously. Today, these findings are standard fare in seminaries across denominations, taught to future pastors and rabbis. Much of it simply doesn't reach the average congregation, not from secrecy, so much as the gap between academic study and weekly preaching. The discoveries here aren't an attack from the edges. They're the mainstream conclusions worked out, in large part by people of faith. None of this is about deciding whether the Bible is true. It's about seeing it more clearly, as a library assembled over 1,000 years, in 3 languages, by many hands, woven from older traditions and shaped by the cultures around it. Knowing that Genesis holds 2 creation stories, that the Gospels were written decades later, that a single translated word can echo for centuries, doesn't shrink the text. For many, it makes it richer, more human, and more astonishing that it has endured at all. Whatever you believe, understanding how the Bible came to be only deepens the experience of reading it. Thanks for watching. If this topic has challenged your thinking, there is a book that takes this exploration even further. AWOMEN, A Serious Look at Religion, written by Rondi Pottinger, builds directly on the scholarship of Bart Ehrman and other leading biblical critics, including Richard Carrier and Reza Aslan. This is not a casual read. It is the result of 15 years of painstaking research into the origins of religious texts, the African roots of biblical stories, and the hidden history of how Scripture was assembled. The book contains QR scan codes throughout the text, linking directly to video references and source materials, so you can verify every single claim for yourself. It covers the complete timeline of how Scripture was written, which books of the Bible actually originated in Africa, the striking similarities between the story of Jesus and earlier mythological figures like Horus, Mithras, Krishna, and Dionysus, and the teachings of Jesus compared to the ancient Egyptian principles of Ma'at. Each chapter is meticulously referenced with academic sources. You can find AWOMEN on Amazon. If you want to understand the full scope of biblical criticism, the African origins of world religion, and the 15-year journey of research that connects all of these dots, this book is an essential resource for your library. The QR scan codes alone make it worth the purchase, giving you direct access to the video lectures, interviews, and source documents that support every claim made in the text. Look for AWOMEN, A Serious Look at Religion, on Amazon, and continue your education far beyond what this video could cover.